Hello and good afternoon, dear friends. This is Mark Tatum back with another edition of 28 Glimpses of Jesus. Hope you and your families are doing well recently, and we are continuing our journey in which we discuss each of the topics of the 28 fundamental beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Of course, we're not primarily interested in these doctrines because they're part of the church list of doctrines. It is because they are biblical, and so we always want to be seeking the Bible's instruction in each of these topics, and truly, since this is called 28 Glimpses of Jesus, asking ourselves, where do we find the character of Jesus revealed in this doctrine? So today we're talking about a doctrine that could be seen as somewhat of a downer, but I really don't. I see this as an incredibly elevating and even exciting principle, and it has to do with being entrusted with things. Can you remember a time when you were entrusted with something significant, perhaps for the first time? Maybe it was the first time you were asked to babysit. Maybe it was the first time your mom let you go into the store and buy some milk on your own. Maybe the first time you drove a car by yourself. That's a big responsibility. And there are a couple of stories that I can remember from my own life, one of which did not go very well, but the other one that did go well. So if you'll indulge me, I'll take a couple minutes to talk about those. First of all, my parents live in a place kind of on the edge of town, kind of near a river where there are a lot of horse properties. And one of my parents' neighbors across the street and a couple houses down had a nice big 5-acre property. And this was a really like deluxe ranch house. It kind of had the house on the hill, and they had horse stables, and they had guest houses, and they had a pool and all sorts of things, and often there were horses in the horse stables. And I remember one summer I got a call from those neighbors, and they said, we are taking our horses out of town for a couple of weeks to go to a horse show, and we're kind of wondering if you would take care of the pool and take care of the dogs. And they said, would you come over and learn how to do it? And I said, yeah, I'd love to. And they, of course, had said, we'll pay you. And so I went over there, and they showed me the pool, and they showed me how to scoop out the leaves that might have fallen in the pool. And they showed me how to change the filter and how to check the pH and, add a couple chlorine tablets if the pH was getting a little off. And then, of course, there were a couple of large dogs. They were very docile dogs, but they showed me, you need to clean up their poops and put them in here. And then here's the dog food. Can you do this for a couple of weeks? Coming over once a day? And I said, yeah, that would be great. And so they went on their trip, and I had the gate key, and first 2-3 days went really normal. I went over there, I cleaned up the pool, I fed the dogs, I picked up their messes, and everything was hunky-dory. And then, partway through that week, I kind of realized, I don't need to just do my tasks and go. Here's a nice pool. Here are chairs around the pool. I could hang out by the pool. And so for a couple of days, I did that. I maybe brought something to read. I brought a stereo system. That was before cell phones. And I would just kind of hang out there. And then after a couple of days of that, I kind of thought, well, there's no real reason to do this hanging out just by myself. I could invite some of my neighborhood friends. And so the next time I said, hey, guys, you want to come see? And I brought a couple of friends. And of course, we took care of the dogs, took care of the pool, did our responsibilities, hung out by the pool for 30 or 45 minutes with some music playing, and it was pretty cool. And then we got to thinking, this is now getting a week, slightly over a week, we got to thinking, man, we don't have to sit there and just be hungry. We could get like pizzas delivered here and stuff. And so by the time we were well into the second week, we were having like a full-on afternoon party for a couple hours every day. Hanging out by the pool, music, pizza, of course doing the responsible stuff, but even like our candy bar wrappers and our boxes of pizza, well, we don't have to clean it up right now because the neighbors aren't going to be home for a few days. And then I remember, and this was probably midway through the second week, one day, I guess between songs on the stereo, I heard from a distance, because this was a 5-acre lot and we were in the middle, I heard from a distance a voice calling. And I looked over there and I squinted, and here was a neighbor at the chain link fence with a white cordless phone in their hands. And they were motioning me to come over. What's this? So I went over there, and as I got close, they said, the owner wants to talk to you. And this neighbor apparently had been keeping an eye and reporting to the owner what was happening and how each day we were kind of taking more and more liberties with the property. And the owner said, is all that I have heard, is this true that you're having friends over and food and you're leaving litter and stuff? And I had to swallow hard. Oh, my heart sunk within my chest, and I had to say, yes, it's true. And they said, I want you to give the keys right now to this neighbor. I want you to clean up and leave the property and not go back. And the neighbor will take care of it from now on. So I lost my privilege partway through. And so, they were still gone for several days, and I was sitting at home, forlorn. And when they came back, I think it was one of my parents brought me an envelope with the money for the days that I had done, the partial payment, but they did pay me for those days. But they said the neighbors are very disappointed with you. And I felt just terrible. I just wanted to shrivel up and die. And I only saw those neighbors a few more times, I think, before either they moved or I moved out of the house to go to college, what have you. But that is a memory that has stuck with me, a very negative memory of when I did not live up to what I was entrusted with. The next story, it's shorter. It's also a bit happier. The summer between my high school and college years, I worked at Toys R Us. I figured, hey, it'd be a fun place to work. Turns out it was a terrible place to work with the tantrums and the parents hitting their kids and leaving the aisles in a whole mess and stuff. That was a really dreadful summer. But one good thing that happened was that was the summer that I think the PS2, the PlayStation 2 came out. And I remember that we got a shipment of PS2s, and they were selling well, but we had enough there. And then one day the manager called me over, and they said, another Toys R Us in another town is out of PS2s. This was in Yorba Linda, I remember. The Yorba Linda Toys R Us is out of PS2s. Would you take a half a dozen over in your car? And I thought, wow, what an interesting prospect. Sure, I would. And I just kind of thought I'd load them up and take them over there. Turns out I had to sign them out, because these are very valuable, right? These are, I forget whether they were $400 or $500 each at the time, but I had to sign all those out, and I had documents, and so somebody, watched the number that we put in my car, and I remember driving over there, and I had like half a dozen of these PS2s in my passenger seat stacked up, and I was just thinking, man, the value of those. Obviously, I wasn't thinking anything nefarious, but I got to the store, and I gave them the PS2s, and they signed my document, and I came back, and when I came back, the manager was very much impressed. Thank you so much for having done that, for helped us out. And it was totally beneficial because I had gotten, like an hour and a half away from the store, and I could drink my drink and listen to my music, and I was doing something good. So I came away from that one feeling really good. So how about you? Do you have some stories that either ended terribly or ended positively? I'd love to hear about those if you would like to mention them down in the comments or something. So, obviously, anytime you get a new opportunity, whether it be a job promotion or a supervisory role of some sort, or even like a credit line increase, that is somebody else saying that you are trustworthy. You are being entrusted with greater resources, greater responsibilities. And similarly, this doctrine of stewardship, we call it, is about God entrusting us with responsibilities, with resources in this world that He created. Now, it's very interesting. You may know that I'm bilingual with Spanish, and in Spanish, the word for stewardship is mayordomia, literally being the head servant, like majordomo in kind of old English terms, kind of a supervisory servant. And that is indeed what God has done for us. If you read early in the book of Genesis, from before sin came into the world, there is language that God is entrusting this creation to humanity, right? God gets Adam and Eve and says, all of the land and all of the plants and all of the animals are for yours to dominate over it. Care for and tend for this garden was God's instruction. God, of course, had made this beautiful environment for them, and He is essentially saying, I am entrusting you with the care of this. And was that revoked after the fall? Certainly Adam and Eve showed that they didn't do great with what they were entrusted with. They broke the one rule that God had set. I think I can identify from the pool story that I told you. But God, in His grace, never said, I'm reneging the entrusting of the world to you. In fact, there is further entrusting language in Genesis 9, when Noah and his family come out of the ark. He says, all the land is yours and the animals, and I'll put the fear of the animals in you. He set some guidelines for how humanity needs to do better after the flood. Further on in the Old Testament, when the children of Israel are going to be entering into the promised land, it is described as a rich land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And God had to push out other nations that were stronger than Israel to do it. But that land of Israel was entrusted to, it was gifted to the Israelites to be His own special possession, His prized possession, into which obviously His intention was to send the Messiah in. Additionally, God entrusted the Israelites with things that were less concrete, but no less important. He entrusted them with knowing His character, knowing His literal name, Yahweh. That's a privilege that God didn't have to give us. He entrusted the Israelites with knowing and keeping His law, and we know they didn't do a great job of that all the time either, did they? God entrusted his people with the temple, with the Ark of his covenant, and really bearing God's reputation in the region with the surrounding nations. God knew that what the people thought of Israel, they were going to be thinking of him. They were really entrusted with a lot. And in fact, I've even heard it said, I've heard preachers say that the third commandment, which was do not take the Lord's name in vain, is far more than just not using God's name or title as a swear word or as an exclamation of surprise. It is about not carrying, right? Taking, do not take, do not carry God's name, which means God's reputation. Do not carry that name vainly, which means emptily or for no purpose. It's a big thing to be entrusted with the knowledge of God and to represent God to others. So we find lots of entrusting language in the Old Testament. The Israelites, sometimes they did well, sometimes they didn't do so well, but we see that God in his grace did not withdraw the entrusting, he did not nullify the covenant with them. Moving on to the New Testament now. Several of Jesus' parables are about God entrusting people with things and how well or how poorly they followed through. For example, there's the parable of the vineyard and the servants. This is found in 3 out of the 4 Gospels. You can see the citations right there. But essentially it says that this wealthy landowner made a nice vineyard and built a wall around it and watered it and put a tower there, really wanted this to be a fruitful vineyard, and then he entrusted it to some servants while he went away. And he told the servants, every now and then you're to send the profits to me from this vineyard while you manage it. Okay, everything's very good. Well, when the time comes to pay the master, the owner of the profits don't show up. And so the owner sends a servant to go collect it. And what do? Do they welcome the servant? Do they treat him well? Do they send him back with the money that they owe? No, it says that they beat him and they scourge him and they send him away bruised and broken. And when the master hears about this, he's mad. He sends a couple more servants who they similarly mistreat. And finally he says, I will send them my son. Surely they will respect my son. But no, they actually murder the son too, and that is about Jesus, about how God had entrusted them with something good, but they had done badly, they had done evil, they had treated the prophets badly, even to the point of killing them, and when the son came, they treated him no better. So that is an example of a parable of bad stewardship. Another one of Jesus' very famous parables is the parable of the talents. Talents was a quantity of money, something like a bag of gold. It was a significant amount of money. And you may remember this. This is from Matthew 25. There was a wealthy landowner who was going away, and he entrusted his 3 servants with 3 different amounts of money. Do you remember that? And so the landowner goes away for however many months or years, and the people work with what they have. And when he comes back, the one who had gotten 5 talents had worked that money, had invested it, had gotten some profit off it, and had 5 more talents. So here are your 10 talents, master. And of course, this parable culminates in that statement which we covet so much to hear from Jesus. Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with little. I will put you in charge of much. Similarly, the one who had gotten 4 talents says, I put your money to work, and here's 4 more talents. Have all of your 8 talents. The exact same answer. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with little. Therefore, I will put you in charge of much. And then comes the 3rd servant who had been trusted less, and rightly so. The servant said, I know you are a hard man, reaping where you do not sow, and digging up what you did not plant. And I knew you were a hard man and you would demand this money, so I buried the money. And the master is angry with him, saying, you should have at least given the money to the bank so that you could collect a small pittance of interest with it. And he says, you wicked servant, get away from me and give this bit of money to the one who had the most. And so that parable has both sides, right? How much we as Christians want to be on the receiving side of that affirmation. Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with little. Let me put you in charge of much. And so that makes my heart say, Lord, I want to be a faithful steward with things we've been entrusted with. So, numerous parables about people being entrusted while the master is away, and how responsible are those who are entrusted when the master's with the master's resources while he's gone. It draws a very close parallel to where we find ourselves today, doesn't it? We are waiting for, hoping for, expecting our Lord Jesus to return soon. He's certainly been gone longer than we expected. And will he find us squandering away the time, squandering away the resources, beating our fellow servants, or what will it take for him to say to us that coveted affirmation, well done, my good and faithful servant? Pray that we would take that to heart today. So let's think of it in the modern day. If God is gone and we're waiting for him to come back, what exactly has he given us? Well, God didn't give me a bag of gold. Hold on. What has God given us? First of all, he's given us time. Time kind of feels like it's infinite. It just keeps coming and coming indefinitely. If I waste half a day or if I waste a couple of weeks, who cares other than needing to get my paycheck, right? But of course, time can be quantified in seconds, in minutes, in days, and years. You can put a number to it. Turns out that a normal lifespan is in the realm of 30,000 days. I'm sure it's a lot. I mean, it's almost practically uncountable, right? Let's just spend it and who cares? But it is, while it is a lot, I consider I'm about halfway there myself. So, Lord, how have I been spending these about 15,000 days I've been alive, and how am I going to spend the next about 15,000 days, should time last long enough? There's even a Bible verse that uses the phrase, redeeming the time. Let us be sober and vigilant and active, redeeming the time, because the days are evil, says Ephesians 5. So this is in regards to walking wisely and not being foolish with the time and the resources that we have. I imagine that one of the heavily implied questions, if not overly stated, when we stand at the judgment seat will be, okay, I've given you all this time, these years, these decades, what did you do with that time? And I just think it would be a terrible thing to not have a good answer. You know, those who have filled their time, their decades with primarily sports fanaticism or video games or promiscuity, what have you, to just be before the Lord and say, I have nothing to show for it. I was just passing the time. What a loss, what a loss. Let's take advantage of the time, take advantage of opportunities that come our way. What else has God given us besides time? He's given us our bodies, hasn't he? They serve us very well. Maybe we forget to say thank you to God or to appreciate our bodies in general. Again, we may think that they are ours to do what we want with. People will abuse and exhaust their bodies, never giving a thought to the idea that they might have to answer to the one who gave it to them. But Scripture says, you are not alone. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And we're brushing up with stuff that we're going to be discussing in a future topic of Christian behavior. That's in our next topic, number 22. But today we want to emphasize the stewardship aspect of it. We've been entrusted with something very good. What are we doing with us? In the light of God's goodness to us that he is entrusting us with. Furthermore, God has entrusted us with a mind. What are we doing with our mind? Are we using it well? Are we putting it to good use? Are we keeping it sober and sharp and active and incisive? Or are we filling it with junk, right? The intellectual equivalent of cotton candy, or worse, right? Are we putting before our eyes and our minds corrosive things, damaging things? Jesus said the eye is the lamp of the body. Whatever the eye is filled with, the body will be filled with, whether light or darkness. And so what do we use our time and our minds and our bodies for and with? What else has God entrusted us with? Of course, physical resources. Although we build buildings and cities and ride around in cars and sleep in beds, none of the material did we create. We're good at moving stuff around, and we can, of course, modify stuff through chemical changes and processes. But think of it, none of the stuff that we utilize on a daily basis, none of it did we cause to be here. So, on a fundamental level, of course, the earth itself, its resources, plant life, from which we get wood and medicines, and not to mention our very food, right? All gifted by God. To, of course, minerals, from which we can make metals, and we can mine and put together stone, and even like coal, which is flammable, to power our lives. And also the animals, who in many cases can be tamed and domesticated to do hard jobs, things that we're not strong enough to do. Think of it, different societies have utilized horses and camels and elephants and oxen to do things, drag heavy stones or turn a mill, so that our lives can be easier. And do we appreciate that, right? To provide us with those materials, things like wool and milk and skins for warmth, we have benefited through the generations from animals. But we didn't make the animals be here. Only God can create an animal. Not to mention, of course, the companionship of the animals with certain species. I know people who get very attached to their dogs or their cats or their birds or their goldfish, but in the old days, a good ox or a good cow or a good horse was very much a partner in the work and the family life. So the earth and everything in it is a great resource, truly the resource from which we get everything else, everything material. But it's not to be exploited. It's not to be strip mined or savagely deforested. Animal populations are not to be completely decimated. Lakes and rivers and oceans are not to be left All of these resources are to be sustainably managed as if we were responsible stewards of the planet, which is what the Bible tells us we are. You know, back in Bible times, they had no concept of actually wearing out the resources, over-polluting or causing climate change. Now we're realizing, wow, with billions and billions of people and pushing everything to the max, we're seeing signs that the earth is kind of getting weak, maybe kind of fragile. The Bible itself said the earth is waxing old like a garment. So of course we need to take care of it. While we do believe God's going to recreate and make another earth, we are called to be good stewards of the earth while we are here. So for those who would put a dividing line between like ecological interests and being a Christian, it's so baffling to me that the supposedly Christian party is the one that is against, ecological preservation and things like that. Very backwards in my view from this principle. And some would connect advocating vegetarianism in connection to this idea of stewardship of the earth. And I can see that. That is a good point. Even though vegetarian isn't expressly instructed in the Bible, a seminary professor once wisely said, we can't prohibit that which the Bible permits. Vegetarianism is probably wiser for our own health and for the planet. But again, we will not be prohibiting any use of meats. Jesus himself ate meat, even distributed meat in the form of fish. So we just want to be balanced in all of our perspectives on that. So we have covered several things God has entrusted us with: our time, our bodies, our minds, the earth's resources. And am I forgetting anything? Anything else? What about the big cha-ching? Money. Money is, in a way, somewhat imaginary, you know? We assign value to these pieces of paper. I can go and exchange it for goods, for food, or gas for my car, what have you. Or, of course, numbers on a computer screen. We think that these hold great value, but money definitely makes the world go round in terms of how we function day to day. I remember a really silly scenario in one of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy book series where a bunch of people through a time machine or accident or whatever it was, I don't really remember what it was, but a bunch of modern day people found themselves in a totally primitive environment. And someone had the bright idea to use leaves as money. Yeah, let's use leaves. That's pretty similar to the bills that we're used to using. And so they started using the leaves for money, but over time, people eventually totally stripped all the trees of their foliage because they wanted more and more money. But of course, there was the same amount of resources to trade the leaves with, and so there was rampant inflation. And so that story just kind of made me laugh at how absurd it was that they ruined the environment and also caused ridiculous inflation, because human logic is not always God's logic. It did make me ask. It was both funny and then sobering, because I would ask, boy, from heaven's view, are we much better than that absurd group of people, destroying the environment, pursuing perceived wealth, yet destroying the very environment that they were dependent on to live. I used to have, when I was in college, I spent some time in Costa Rica as a student missionary, and I bought a t-shirt and brought it back, and it said something along the lines of, maybe after we have burned the last tree and killed the last animal and polluted the last river, maybe then we will realize that we can't eat money. So wow, it's true. We can become so blinded by money, and our priorities can get so out of whack in producing it that we can end up killing the very thing for which we're supposedly making the money for by the act of pursuing it. Isn't that a sad irony, friends? And so the simplistic way which I kind of see money, to kind of make sense of all the complicatedness of the finance world, money is basically our way of keeping track of the favors that we do for each other and what we're owed. We obviously, primitive economics was like a barter system, right? I'll teach your kids to read, and you provide me some food, you provide me some milk, you provide me some shelter, you provide me a goat skin for warmth, you give me a haircut, and then we'll call it even, because we've all done something for each other. And then money came kind of a go-between to quantify, to keep track of the ones who I've done a ton of favors for people without asking for favors in return for a while. I can cash in a bunch of favors at once, or I can get a big favor, something modern day equivalent, something have a car made for me, etc. And then there's the whole arena of extending people credit, which we won't go down that rabbit hole, but yeah, it just continues to get more complicated from that. But as Christians, how shall we relate with money? Money is a seductor and a tempter, is it not? Firstly, I think to have a positive, healthy view of money as a Christian is to understand, first principle, all wealth comes from God. Even the ability to create wealth comes from God. And I'm so glad that God put this in His Word. Immediately before the children of Israel were to enter the promised land in the book of Deuteronomy, God says this in chapter 8 of Deuteronomy. We'll start with verse 10. God says, when you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I'm giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Jumping to verse 17, it says, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors, as it is today. So let's remember that our very ability to create wealth comes from the Lord. Some of us have what are traditionally called blue-collar jobs, right? We work hard with our muscles and our hands. We make the money. How do you think those hands and those muscles work? Because God has put energy in them through the food that we eat. Some of us are what would be called white-collar jobs. We primarily use our mind to produce wealth for our families. How do you think the neurons are firing in the brain? It's because God has programmed it to be so. So let us not make the sin of presumption, especially since God warned us about it in the Bible, to think, I deserve this money just for myself. I made it myself. I worked hard. Therefore, it's all mine. Yeah, but who gave you your mind? Who gave you your body so that you could do good work and create that wealth? This, of course, in a practical sense, means not using money frivolously, using it carefully, using it only for things that will benefit us and others, not drinking it away, not, like the prodigal son, right? Wasting it on prostitutes. No. Modern day, not gambling with it. Many have become destitute through amassing debts of gambling. And even if you do win money, it's still a tragedy because money has lost its value in your mind and its definition as a metric of work put in and the value that you get out of your hard work. Many people want to have a windfall and just have a ton of money. I can't say I'm excluded from that, but God kind of makes the resources a bit scarce and the money a bit scarce so that we will appreciate it when we do have it and treat it carefully. Jesus outright says in Matthew 6, this is in the Sermon on the Mount, you cannot serve both God and money. And he literally, if you read an old translation there, he literally said, can't serve God and mammon. Mammon was sometimes personified as the god of wealth or the god of money. No polytheism in our faith, right? Even if money is the one that's competing for God's attention. You got to have one in first place. And Jesus, just a few verses later, expressly says what needs to be in first place. Seek first God's kingdom and God's righteousness, and God will see to it that you have what you need. That's 6:33. You can trust him in that. Don't spend your mind with, hamster on the hamster wheel. How can I get more wealth? How can I get more stuff? So many people pursue that primarily throughout their lives. They get to the end of the life and they realize that there isn't a whole lot of value. There isn't a whole lot that they have clung to. Many people will prioritize money over relationships or over ethics, or, it'll become all-consuming. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, says the Apostle Paul to his apprentice Timothy. Now, let's talk about another principle of being responsible with our money, and that is with the principle of tithing. Tithing, kind of an old-fashioned complicated word, but tithing, it really comes from the word tenth. It means returning your first 10% of your income to God. The first tenth of your increase is what it says in the Bible. This is outlined in Scripture in several places. First of all, in Genesis 14:20, God helped Abraham to win a significant battle and win back his nephew and his nephew's family and a whole bunch of spoils. And Abraham comes to the king of Salem, who was also a priest of the Most High God, monotheistic, and Abraham tithes one-tenth of the war spoils to Melchizedek, the priest of Salem and the king of Salem. Several chapters later, Abraham's grandson, Jacob, in his vow to the Lord, if God will be my God and bring me safely back to this place, then I will give 1/10 of my increase to God. So we see that those first expressions of tithing are voluntary in terms of the people want to enter into that. A bit later in the book of Leviticus, this is again after they've been enslaved in Egypt, but before they've entered the promised land, it says there in the book of Leviticus that 1/10 of the fruit of the land is holy to God. It is to be set aside for a special purpose. And that was actually to sustain the Levites. They were 1 out of 12 tribes, right? So therefore, if they're receiving 1 out of 10 of the fruit of the land, which means grain and fruit and oil and animals, they can be well sustained so that the priesthood can function. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 and 10 says, honoring the Lord with our wealth should come first. Do not give the last 10%. Do not bring a lame offering, right? Give the first 10% to God. When I pay my bills, whenever payday comes, I do my donations to the church first. Another principle, this one uses some strong language. Malachi 3, 8 through 12, not strong language in the way the world thinks is strong language, but it says, you are robbing God. And the people are confused. How are we robbing God? And the answer comes by withholding your tithes. You're trying to keep your houses nice while the Lord's house is in disrepair. No wonder your wealth and your grain and everything is like falling through your fingers and you can never seem to amass enough of it. Prioritize God first. Blessings will come. You will not be able to contain the blessing if you will honor God first with your tithes, is the lesson in Malachi chapter 3. And I want to pause here for just a minute with the Bible verses to clarify what we're talking about. I want to make sure that we understand what we're not talking about. First of all, we are not thinking that we are paying God for blessings. We fully reject a transactional orientation for our religion. I've given this to God, therefore he owes it to me. No, 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 no. God has given us first. We are simply recognizing our appreciation and our affirmation of God and his principles by agreeing to enter into this financial partnership with the Lord. This is not to pay for blessings, but rather it is to show our commitment to his kingdom, his principles as first priority in our lives. And it is to further the gospel with. That's where tithes go, to the church that proclaims God's truth out in society. And really it means to partner with God financially. Yes, on a personal level, it means I will live 10% more humbly than others around me might, or than I would otherwise. I may live in a house with smaller square footage than others. I may drive a bit of an older car than others. But I would rather be practically trusting God for my continued sustenance rather than trusting that 10% to provide for me what I need. In Bible times, before money was primarily the thing for economics, it was about, the wealth was in the herds, right? And it was in the crops. And people would sacrifice animals directly to God. They would literally put it up on an altar, slit its throat, and burn the remnants. Sacrifice, of course, was a couple of things. First of all, a symbol of substitutionary atonement. It pointed to Jesus in that way. But it also had huge financial implications. It meant when you sacrificed an animal, you were giving up all the profitable byproducts that animal could offer you. The milk, the fur or the wool, the skins, and also all future offspring, which you can imagine is exponential toward the future. If this goat were to have 5 kids, literal kids when it's a goat, if this goat were to have 5 kids and then those 5 were to have 5 of each of their own, you'd have 25, and if each of those had 5, you'd have 125, and it just gets exponential the further into the future you think of it, and you have all of their byproducts too, their skins and their milk and their offspring. And so, every animal that sacrificed was very significant financially. I feel like in a system like that, I'd never eat an animal just for pleasure. Just think of all that I'm giving up as I just gobble up for a momentary pleasure. But wow, to give 1/10 of your offspring to God is really something. That was really I like to say, that's where the rubber meets the road of faith. You're saying, I value my relationship with God, and I trust God more than what this animal and all its resources and all its future offspring could offer me. That's how much. And it's to remind us that God is important. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We often tend to think that our money follows our primary priorities. But Jesus actually says it's the other. Wherever your treasure goes, that's where you'll find your priorities, your heart, your passions, your convictions following you. And so I'm thankful that in my life, it's never been a question whether I am going to tithe, whether I got a few dollars for mowing the lawn as a kid or my first minimum wage job. I always made sure to faithfully give that 10%. It has just never been a question. And so I'm thankful. Further on in the Old Testament, like we mentioned in Leviticus, the Old Testament, you had the principle that the tithes from the 11 normal tribes of Israel were used in sustaining the priesthood. That enabled one of the tribes, the Levites, to be fully occupied in running the temple, doing other priestly duties for the people, etc. Everything from marriage ceremonies to circumcisions to declaring, whether things are clean or unclean, doing all of the sacrifices, keeping the temple upkept and maintained, all of that. Now, I will clearly say and admit that the principle of tithing is one that is debated by Christians. It begs the question, are modern day pastors like the priestly Levites in the Old Testament? Well, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. Pastors are full-time workers for the Lord. It can be a surprise, I think, for lay people to discover, but there's a lot that goes into managing and running a church. I won't get into all the details here, but I tell you, it's plenty to spend 40, if not more, hours a week. A pastor's work is never done, actually. But on the other hand, modern-day pastors are not priests in the same sense that the Levites were, in that modern-day pastors are not doing efficacious work to save others in the same way. We have, of course, the principle in Protestantism of the priesthood of all believers, which I fully and strongly believe in. We, of course, believe that any church member can work out their own salvation between them and the Lord, and they can pray efficacious prayers for faith and healing and salvation for themselves and for others. So I praise the Lord for that. But pastors, in large part, represent the denomination or the church institution to the members. And even more importantly, pastors somewhat represent God to society. If people out in society have significant theological questions, often they will seek out a pastor for answers. Back to the debatability of tithing by evangelical Christians. I've heard it said by some, well, tithing isn't required nowadays, modern days, because it's not in the New Testament. Remember that old litmus test that they have? Not only must it be in the Bible, but it must be in the New Testament. We've covered this at least once previous installment, I know. We believe that the New Testament is a solid unit with the Old Testament. That's why it's in one Bible, right? It's a continuation. Yes, the New Testament is the greater and the greatest revealing of God's character and the plan of salvation. But I believe that, frankly, unless something is actually revoked in the New Testament that comes from the Old Testament, something like circumcision or the Jewish feast days that we are explicitly told don't need to be followed, we believe anything else still stands. There's no reason to jettison that belief, other than maybe the fact that, well, we really don't want to do it. And so that seems to be reason enough for some to try to seek justification for not needing to tithe. Although I will admit tithing isn't specifically mentioned in the New Testament, generously giving is. Jesus, first of all, never discouraged tithing. He even he elevated, and as an example, the woman who gave her last 2 cents out of the temple. Look, all these others gave out of their abundance, but this woman gave out of her poverty. And that is so profound to me, especially given the fact that where those tithes, where those donations were going to, was going to the system to sustain the priests that were at the same time conspiring to kill Jesus. It's incredible that Jesus didn't encourage diverting funds from the temple, from the system that God had set up. He could have said, hey guys, I'm going to be starting a new church. Let's start the tithe diverting now. No, as long as Jesus was alive, it was still going to the temple. Furthermore, there are other passages about giving. For 2 Corinthians, it says, God loves a cheerful giver. So let's not give reluctantly or with a grudge. God would have us do it with a thankful heart, with a grateful heart. Truly, He's given us so much more than our mere 10% could ever pay Him back. It also says in the New Testament a couple of places, Jesus says it and Paul says this principle, that gospel workers are worth their wages. And here are the verses for that. So it begs the question, how else would the ministers be sustained unless giving by members of the church is significant and steady? Something like tithing really seems to be the key, even if it's not explicitly stated in such terms in the New Testament itself. So we see from this principle, particularly from the story of the woman giving her 2 mites, we see that giving to God has 2 sides. The side from the giver, which is the side that most of us are on, actually it's the side that all of us are on, as even the Levites were told to tithe in the Old Testament, so pastors are to tithe today. But most of us only experience the giving side. There is a blessing in giving and trusting God that cannot be abrogated, even if the receiving side is corrupt, as it was in Jesus' day. For the giver, trusting in the Lord, partnering with Him financially, one's conscience is clear, of course. They will receive the blessings for their financial faithfulness to God, their stewardship. But on the receiving side, those who receive the tithes, they will absolutely answer to God for how they utilize the tithes. I think financial fraud from tithe receivers, whether it might be a pastor dipping his hand into the offering plate to put a little bit in his pocket, or if it's something like risky investments on the part of the organization done with tithe money, Lord, forgive. These tithe receivers will absolutely answer to God on Judgment Day for what they did with the money that they were entrusted with by people of faith and giving it in faith, what was truly done with God's money. For us in Adventism, I've heard that our tithing percentage is the envy of many other denominations. I remember in college, one of my professors enthusiastically saying that Adventists tithe at a remarkable participation rate. 40% of Adventists tithe. And I remember thinking, I even said it out loud, 40%? That's terrible. When you were so excited, I thought you were going to say 80%, 90%. But he said, no, 40% is very good. Other denominations would love to have the financial support structure and participation percentage that we do. Many other denominations, it's like 15%. He also said, and this really surprised me, this is back in the early to mid 2000s, he said that Loma Linda University Church, which is our biggest church here in our conference and our part of the United States here, Loma Linda Church was bringing in as much tithe as the Crystal Cathedral, which was a well-known megachurch at the time. Sadly, Crystal Cathedral has now gone defunct, but at the time I remember thinking, man, that's incredible that one of our churches, while it's a big church, was nothing in terms of public visibility or just public display of wealth as Crystal Cathedral. It's probably only the Mormon denomination or religion that has a stronger percentage of tithe payers than Seventh-day Adventists do. Although they, of course, use some coercion tactics that Adventists don't. You've got to get that temple recommend if you're going to attend a family member's wedding or if you're going to take part in some of those temple rites. I don't even know exactly what they are, but I know that they withhold access to the temple if you're not an active tithe payer. But I love the idea that we are God's servants, that we are God's entrusted caretakers of the resources He has given us, caring for His property while He's away. He will come back and He will ask, what have you done with the time, with the resources, with the money that I entrusted you with? Let's take a minute to read the text here from the Fundamental Belief document on the concept of stewardship. It reads like this. We are God's stewards, entrusted by Him with time and opportunities, abilities and possessions, and the blessings of the earth and its resources. We are responsible to Him for their proper use. We acknowledge God's ownership of faithful service to Him and our fellow human beings, and by returning tithe and giving offerings for the proclamation of His gospel and support of the growth of His church. Stewardship is a privilege given to us by God for nurture and love and the victory over selfishness and covetousness. Stewards rejoice in the blessings that come to others as a result of their faithfulness. And then there, as usual, at the bottom, you have the list of Bible verses, some of which we have discussed today. So it's true, when you look either at, our missions system or our structure system, so the church is way out in deserted places with very small populations, can have pastors and can have resources. It's very heart-affirming, very fulfilling in our hearts to know that. Well, as we begin to draw to a close, we of course want to ask the question, where is Jesus in this doctrine? Is Jesus' character revealed? Of course, we mentioned Jesus' parables about the stewards while the master was away. He is the good master. He is the one who we will be answering to. He is the one who has entrusted us with these time and these resources. And also, given that Jesus is considered our priest or our high priest, we have more of that on a upcoming installment on the sanctuary doctrine, but sustaining the modern day priesthood of pastors and of the denomination can rightly be seen as sustaining the high priest. At the very least, it's at least sustaining the will of the high priest. And thirdly, with our concept of Jesus being the head of the church. You may remember from our previous discussion on the church and its unity and diversity, Paul says that Jesus is the head of the church. When we tithe to the church, we are contributing to the health of the body of which God is the head. In fact, I don't even like the phrase as I say it, tithing to the church. We tithe to the Lord. The church is just the Lord's chosen vehicle for being His witness and His proclamation of salvation to the world. So when I tithe, I keep those principles in mind. I am trusting in Jesus for my personal life, for my financial sustenance. Sometimes I do look at that quantity that I'm getting ready to donate and I'm thinking, man, what could I buy with that? And if I save that up for a few months, what would that be able to get me? But then I think, is it worth trading in my good, clear conscience, my relationship with the Lord? I would hate to go through life feeling like there was a little bit of a blockage. I don't believe God stops His ears from our prayers or stops loving us or blessing us or any of those things. But it's just like, why would I, from my side, cut this relationship short? I would be stifling it from my side. So, whenever I pay tithe, I keep in mind I'm trusting Jesus for my personal financial sustenance, and also it is for the health of the church and the furtherance of the gospel, so that people can have jobs as pastors and teachers and administrators that are all very needed for the work to continue. So I pray that you can find your joy, your fulfillment in trusting God financially as well. You could really say that it's where the rubber meets the road of faith. While it's relatively easy to say, Lord, Lord, and say some heartfelt prayers, but to sacrifice a significant portion of one's income, they are really putting their trust on the line. As we finish up, I want to share an encouraging and an inspiring story of somebody I heard once. I've heard many stories of God coming through at the last minute, financially for people who were in need. I know some people personally that's happened to. But let me share a testimony with you, even though this is secondhand. When I was pastoring out in the low desert, my first church, the treasurer and her husband, particularly the husband, he got up once and gave this testimony at offering time. So the husband had been brought up in the church, knew about the Lord and the gospel and all this and the principle of tithing, but he'd been away from the church for like 15 years and he didn't tithe. And then when he met his future wife, the woman who was our church treasurer, he re-entered the church. I think he got rebaptized. They were married for a little while, but he continued to be nagged in the back of his head for those 15 years he had not paid tithe. And he wrestled with it. He would lose sleep over it. And he actually sat down and did the math. And he approached his wife once saying, I'm feeling convicted about this 15 years of tithe I didn't make. I've calculated how much I made, how much tithe I owe, and I want to commit to a plan, darling, to return this tithe to the Lord in 2 years. So think of that. Returning 15 years of tithe in 2 years, that's going to be a major cut to the family budget. And so they discussed, there's a very admirable motive, but what's it going to mean for paying our bills and for our financial obligations? And they talked about it and they did the math and they were really going to have to scrimp and save. They were really going to have to tighten the belt. But this man just said, I have to do it. God has given me so much. I have to tithe. And so that first Sabbath, I don't know if this was the new year or what, but the first Sabbath came and he wrote the check for the significantly larger amount so that he could pay back this tithe over 2 years. He put that check in the plate and he let it go by. He finished up the Sabbath. He had Sunday. He was still thinking about it. Monday morning, his boss called him into the office. Yes, boss, what would you like? The boss gave him a promotion and gave him a raise, and the amount of the raise was exactly the amount that they had come to of how much they would need to increase their giving, their tithing, to pay back that 15 years worth of tithe in just 2 years. He said it was as if God was saying to him, I affirm you in your desire, your conviction to give that tithe back, but tell you what, I'm going to give you the raise. I'm essentially going to pay for that tithe to come back myself. And that just gave me tingles to hear that testimony, and it still does. It's a wonderful thing. Imagine going home from work and telling your spouse that I got a pay raise, exactly the additional amount of what I put in the tithe offering plate last Sabbath. Wow. So that is one that I will never forget. Oxley was the man's name. I think Ron Oxley, if I remember correctly. I wonder if he's still living. Wow, wonderful testimony. Well, thank you for having spent this time. I pray that you, whether you have been a tither or have not been a tither, would be taking this into consideration. And it's not just the tithing. Forgive me for getting, too narrowly focused on just the tithing. It's all aspects of stewardship. It's our time, it's our resources, it's our energy, it's our mind, it's our opportunities, in addition to the money that we make. So may we be faithful in all aspects to God. May God show us, faithfulness back so that we can rejoice and see the evidences of it. And may it all contribute to living the abundant life that Jesus talked about. Hope this has been a blessing to you. Next time we'll be back with our next installment, number 22, on Christian behavior. Hope that you will join us again as we continue our journey of deepening our faith through these biblical principles. Please greet your family, your loved ones from me and my family. We love you. We pray that you have a good continuation of your year 2025. It's just at the beginning of February as I'm filming this. Blessings to you and your family. Thank you so much. Bye-bye and God bless.